Today is Earth Day, and on Earth Day 2023, that's now 3 years ago, we had our first session for this earthworm practice in the so-called Anthropocene. And it was also the opening days of the Aloka Earth Room here on 3 Jones Place in San Rafael. So today we're going to go into the 4th year of this practice. And I can definitely observe, that it's slowly but surely becoming more established and become more steady. And, even the numbers of people who participating go up and down, but there's quite a steady group of people who come regularly. And we are starting with a new series this year. Every time I give the year a different title, and for this year I've chosen New Ways of Looking Earth as Teacher. New Ways of Looking Earth as Teacher. And that, relates directly to what Joanna Macy calls seeing with new eyes. Joanna Macy's work on, the work that reconnects. And the seeing with new eyes is the result of the practice. And then if we see with new eyes, we can really have more of a direct experience of our interconnectedness, of our embeddedness. And in that way, new ways of responding become available to us. Because we know on a sensing level we are not alone. We are just previously have been caught in a certain worldview, which turns out to be just what it is, a worldview, but not really how it is. And this particular training to basically free ourselves from the old domination worldview, that's what we are trying to do here together. And expand perception and to have increasing capacity for attunement to where we are and how we are, rather than believing certain patterns of conditioning which we have learned in our family, in our school, our culture, our language, all of that. And it's not about learning, some exotic, detailed procedures from indigenous traditions from other countries, but it's a remembering of our own indigeneity. Even, it's in the more distant past, but it's still deeply embedded in our bodies. And through this work we are doing, we can slowly but surely, unfreeze our systems and slowly but surely access that particular way of knowing about our deep embeddedness. And sometimes, we might have short bouts of recognition, and I certainly remember, when I was younger, when I was a child, like about 5, 6, 7 years old, I would have books about early humans, and I would very often, just like sit in front of those books and try to zoom myself into a cave where I would imagine to sit, with early humans and how that would be, how I would feel. That was very fascinating to me then. And then I also remember a particular experience I mentioned when I was about 15. My parents took me to Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania, and I met for the first time Maasai tribal nation on their own ancestral land, and how deeply that touched me. Another way, how they were walking and how they were going about their daily lives, that communicated something which I deeply had lost. There was a sense of grief which arose in me, which I really didn't understand intellectually, but my whole body was signaling me that this was something very, very important, and I never forgot it. And then it took me to study cultural anthropology, and it took me many, many places, and what I'm doing today is coming a full circle, coming back to that recognition I had very, very early when I was a child. And it still is a deep motivation, for what I do and what I try to do, let's say. And it has sent me so many places because there was so much stuff which needed to be cleared out, so much, conditioning and trauma and all the rest of it. And there's still a lot to be done, but it's a little bit better now than it was then. And I can sense possibility, and I can sense that there is a path. And in particular grateful, to the Buddha's teaching on the Noble Eightfold Path, which is a very clear kind of a scaffolding, how to steady oneself in the midst of all of these materials, coming up. Because if you really want to connect with the land where we are, we have to address and sense and feel through all of that which has not been addressed. So, to go through this work of attunement, we must first understand, literally to stand under, and connect, with the ground by standing under all the unfinished business of this land, in particular here in the US and in Canada as well, that has brought us to where we are today. Knowing that this land has been taken from tribal nations, and a lot of the wealth has been built on the back of people who have been kidnapped from Africa. So this is a huge burden, a huge karmic layer, which if it's not addressed, it will keep the population separate from the land. And then, these amazing things can happen, as we can see now, where people get so desperate that they don't care an iota for ethics. I mean, even the president of the country is really like a mafia boss, really. It's incredible. So that's where we have gotten ourselves into. It's pretty tragic. And then there are tribal nations and people of color in the US and indigenous people worldwide who have already survived what many of us fear is coming. Displacement, violence, hunger, all of that stuff, which indigenous peoples worldwide, tribal nations in the US, people of color have experienced, under the onslaught of colonialism. So, to really allow those fears to become conscious is part of the work in order to connect with the land. Because not only the victims are traumatized, also the perpetrators are traumatized. We are all traumatized. Which means we are stuck, frozen, in that unfinished business. And the President of the United States is a very good example. Somebody so profoundly disconnected from what's needed right now. That's like absolutely mind-boggling. And he's not the only one, but there's tons of people around him propping him up, of course. But they're all kind of insane, really. So yes. So the only way, to unfreeze all of that stuff is to step back into life and to bear with all of the pain and the confusion which that brings about. And I think that's, in a kind of as good way as possible, try to build up a system here, with the earth listening for that. And, I once saw Pat McCabe, Woman Stand Shining, she was saying, to get from that paradigm to that paradigm, from the domination paradigm to the circle and then to the heart. That's the work we are trying to do. And of course, it's not as simple as, it can be expressed in words like, okay, we know what to do, but then really doing it requires a lot of feeling, a lot of feeling and sensing. And for that, we really need a scaffolding to hang on to, because it's deeply challenging. As this old paradigm of domination, extraction, and fossil fuel dependence is getting slowly metabolized, because there's no way to go anymore. If you don't want to just go out and bomb everybody, you have to just look and feel. Yeah, so it's a really an amazingly huge recognition, that we have basically gone as far as we have been able to go, and now we have to stop and go deeper. And we do have a teaching for that. We have the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path as a scaffolding to work with our minds and hearts, and we have indigenous worldviews in order to snap out of that old way of looking at the world as a sewage and system and a big shopping mall. And to outgrow this immature way of looking. And today I've brought a poem which I've received just on Saturday at Spirit Rock for the Earth Day. James Burrows was reading it out, and I asked him, he can send me a copy. And it's called The World is Both Burning and Blooming. And it's by Karen Salmansohn. You get the bad news and the sunrise in the same day. You cry over the headlines, then you laugh at a baby wearing a head shaped like a bear. This is the dual citizenship of being alive. Rage and reverence, grief and grace. You are allowed to feel both. You are allowed to scream and still notice how good the soup is. You don't have to choose. Let it all in. You get the bad news and the sunrise in the same day. You cry over the headlines, then you laugh at a baby wearing a head shaped like a bear. This is the dual citizenship of being alive. Rage and reverence, grief and grace. You are allowed to feel both. You are allowed to scream and still notice how good the soup is. You don't have to choose. Let it all in. So with that, we can change over to meditation. We have about 40 minutes. Please find a posture which works for you. And bringing the awareness to the body, particularly maybe the torso right now. I can sense a contraction, or maybe you can also sense it in your jaw, your temples. And from that, coming to the place where the body meets the cushion, the chair. The sense of hardness, structure, pressure, earth element, and the gravitational pull which keeps us where we are, here on this planet, deeply, deeply connected and far from separate. And if you can, just send your awareness into the ground underneath where you're sitting. Even you're sitting maybe in a second, third, fourth floor, the house still stands on the ground. So bringing awareness down. Down into the soil, which is made up of many, many dead forms which have died over the millions of years and now make up this very rich substance we call humus, we call soil, we call earth, which gives birth to everything we have, every other living being, human and more than human. Everything has arisen out of this soil in response to the sunlight. The heat, the temperature. So really, zooming out into a much expanded way of looking at who we are and where we are, as Bette McCabe calls it, and how it is. And if the mind wanders off into thinking about something, just bringing it back, sensing into the hardness, the earth element where the body meets the cushion, the chair, and then sending awareness down underneath into the ground like a tree sends down its roots. Meeting many other root systems and mycelium and life forms down there. It's a whole big, rich place down there. And the vastness, the stillness, the stability, the ancientness of all of this, which keeps us alive. It sends up all of the food, the trees, producing the oxygen, being so much, at the base of who we are. So breathing in that stillness, that stability, and attuning to that. So deepening and allowing the body to come into sync with these depths of connection. We live every moment, but we are not aware of it. It requires like a slowing down. And it's not easy for the body to slow down to that pace. So it requires patience, requires willingness, to be with that feeling of stepping out of a habit into something different, a bit confusing, a bit uncomfortable. But once, we connect, there's a sense of depth and profundity, which is, healing. It's a medicine. It's almost like a coming home to earth. And really acknowledging the dependency and the relationship. Not just like, tiptoeing around it at the edges and feeling ever unstable and estranged and confused and impoverished, really. And then consuming is the answer to kind of get rid of that feeling there's something not quite adding up, and maybe if I buy one more something, it's gonna stop. And then rushing to the next one, and the next one. That's how we are conditioned. And all of these technologies, which have come about in the last, 100 years, they have really severed the connection. I mean, let's say the conscious connection, because we're still connected because we eat, drink and breathe the planet all the time, but we no longer know about it on a visceral level. That's why we can do the things we do. And that's why indigenous peoples, which make up only 6.2% of the global population, take care of 80% of the biodiversity, because that's just what you do when you know. You can't help it because it's just stupid not to do it. Not to look after what gives you life is just stupid. You know, any animal knows that. That's basic. So that's what's happened, you know, if we rely too much on our intellect, and it can be adjusted. It's totally possible. And that's what we are trying to do here in these gatherings, to really balance out that overemphasis of the intellect. And the intellect is a servant, but it can't be the master, because the intellect can't access relationality. Because that's something which needs to be sensed and felt. And you know, thinking about it can help to set the stage, but then the work itself is through sensing and feeling. Kind of a rewiring of neural pathways, which open up, you know, a kind of different way of responsibility, a much deeper responsibility, much more in sync with reality. And it can't be rushed. It needs to move at the speed of trust. Trusting our own capacity that we can do this. That we also are part of a living, intelligent earth, just like indigenous peoples are. And we just got sidetracked, we just got excited by all of the promises of technology and shopping malls and so on, and now we see, no, that's not the way to go. We need to start all over again. And rather than being used by these technologies, we want to make wise choices. And that's, you know, it needs to start by that, with that recognition and a kind of a statement, you know, that's what we want. That's necessary. So you're sensing the body and the deep roots into the soil, that we eat, drink and breathe this planet 24/7. And we are like we are like plants coming out of it and then staying around for some time and then go back, come out of it again, go back and learn from these experiences. We can use the Noble Eightfold Path as guidelines, how to use this opportunity well. And being aware of the breathing process. Which slows down if the body, the mind settle. As we're going in the 4th year of this little community of earthworms in the so-called Anthropocene. And sensing into the aliveness, the vitality of the body, which is kept going through food, drink and breathing, which comes from the vast body of the earth we are sitting inside of. And opening to instructions from that vast system, which knows what to do since such a long time, was able to sustain life for almost 5 billion years without anyone directing it. It's a mystery, and we are part of that mystery. And you can consciously participate and ask for guidance. How can we participate best for our own benefit and for the benefits of all beings? And the response will come through our life circumstances. our gifts, our talents, our location. And the depth of the separateness. When that is felt, when that is sensed, that has an effect on our thinking. Slowly but surely, it starts to infiltrate and recondition us by understanding, to really stand under this aliveness, this vitality, meaning to really allow it to be felt. In particular on this Earth Day, which is a day to celebrate this amazing planet. So far, the only planet which has this vast numbers of diversity. A living being of great beauty and power. And we are part of it. So whenever the mind wanders off into thinking about something or getting dull, just coming back to sensing the vitality, the aliveness in the body. And that aliveness being the way how Earth communicates with us. And by connecting with that aliveness, that vitality, which is quite a subtle object, for the mind to, or for awareness to connect with, it refines our capacity for awareness. It expands the perception and refines it also. And that's, what's needed to adjust to a more conscious participation, rather than, being lost in the dream of controlling and dominating, which is simply not possible and also wouldn't be fun. Because we don't need to dominate this intelligence. Because it knows what to do since a very long time. So this seeing with new eyes, a new way of looking at ourselves and where we are. That's what's needed, that's that change in consciousness which is needed in order to continue. In order to make sure that future generations have a place to land. And for that we don't need to imitate indigenous cultures, but we just need to find our own recognition of that, and it's not rocket science. But it needs to be learned, like a new language. And it's good to have settings for that, such as our group, where it can be done, in community. And I also offer Earth listening circles at the Earth Room, which is a, in-person opportunity, like a ceremony almost, where we are doing this together, very intentional and honoring each other's recognition and creating a safe, brave space. So connecting with the great good fortune we all have, that we can be consciously at that threshold and offer our services, offer our awareness, offer our love into that process, our willingness to serve it. That's a great stabilizer, I feel, in this time of challenge. To being able to choose to not look away and project the fear out onto others, but to being willing to feel it and sense it in our own way, in a group which is brave and safe, and see what happens. You get the bad news and the sunrise in the same day. You cry over the headlines, then you laugh at a baby wearing a hat shaped like a bear. This is the dual citizenship of being alive. Rage and reverence, grief and grace. You are allowed to feel both. You are allowed to scream and still notice how good the soup is. You don't have to choose, let it all in. So we have another 3 minutes or so, and then I'm going to ring the bell.